Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom with Bob Olson, who will now introduce today's show and speaker.
Welcome to the open door. I have left an open door before you, which no one can close, open to the love of God, open to joining the stream of love for others. The open door. And here is our panel that will be with us as usual today. Dr. Rhonda Chervin, Professor of Philosophy at Holy Apostles College and Seminary in Connecticut originally, now a dedicated widow, author of numerous books about Catholic living. And then we have Dr. Richard Garrity from Birmingham, Alabama, Professor of Philosophy at EWTN, writer of books about Aristotle's Ethics, Plato's Republic, who is writing a book also about Blessed Cardinal Newman's Apologetics. And then we have Dr. Jim Hannock from Los Angeles, philosophy professor, father of 5 children, pro-life activist, editor at New Oxford Review.
And we have a guest today, Kemi Ingram, who, among many other things, is a digital advocate. That is to say, she is active in all sorts of social media, and she is active, among other ways, in helping those who are poor and giving some sort of direction to those who are poor, which takes us to our topic for this morning. Who are the poor and how can we help them? And I'm going to just turn this question over to the panel and to our welcome guest, Kemi Ingram, and I will expedite and from time to time intervene and maybe pose the next question that comes from this pair of questions that lead us to some serious soul-searching and questioning. So again, who are the poor and how can we help them? Panel, guest.
Okay, so there isn't a gap. I try to wait and let other people speak first. This is Rhonda. I work on it very hard, even though I'm usually not successful, because as soon as there's a 1-second gap around the table, I leap in saying, well, nobody else is going to start, then I will. Okay, I've had a great problem with this question in this way, that I really got into caring about the poor after my conversion from an atheist but anti-communist background, where we considered as kids people who were big into what we now call social justice as probably left-wing commies, and so we didn't pay any attention to them. We just voted Republican. Okay, so now I become a Catholic at 21. And this whole issue of helping the poor comes up, but I'm pretty poor because I'm a graduate student, so I don't take it very seriously because I figure there's nothing I can do anyway. But then my twin sister got involved with the Catholic worker. She also became a Catholic in her 20s. She got involved with the Catholic worker movement, and she went off with a prophetic young man. Now, this is before drugs and hippies. And he suggested, she was a dancer and she became a sacred dancer. She's a very famous sacred dancer, as a matter of fact. Her maiden name is Carla de Sola. So he convinced her that they should walk through the streets and in front of churches and dance the gospel and so on and so forth. But his proviso was that she should take absolutely no money with her whatsoever, and they should depend on people taking care of them. as they went along. And because she was in love with him, she agreed to this proposition. So this was huge to me. I couldn't imagine living without any money. And I was married with kids and married to a businessman. So it got me to move from sort of middle-class assumptions to a great desire to live more simply and help the poor. And that took the form all through my married life. My husband didn't agree with this at all. And his idea was everything in the world is put there by God for me to enjoy, and God is disappointed if I don't eat it and take it. So we had very great disagreements on this, but he happened to go to one of the first talks of Mother Teresa of Calcutta in Los Angeles, and he said, okay, you can tithe Mother Teresa, let her help the poor, but if she dies first, that's it. So we started tithing Mother Teresa, and then when my husband died, I started just living very simply and giving everything extra to the poor through Mother Teresa's nuns, okay, and also to pro-life. So I got involved in helping the poor in that way. But these questions continually arise in my mind. How is it that a street person who is one of the poorest people in the world that I see constantly around me, how is it that a street person has no money for food but has money for booze and drugs? Or how is it that someone who considers themselves very, very poor by contemporary U.S. standards still has to have a TV, has to have a cell phone, and that this is more important to them than food even? And how is it that people in the concentration camps who had no food still have cigarettes? So these sort of nasty questions keep running through my head, and I'm hoping that you on this program will give me answers to some of that.
I happen to know that our visitor is in the Orthodox tradition, and I'll wager more than a thin dime that she could refer us to what St. John Chrysostom says about the undeserving poor. Is that true?
Well, perhaps. I was going to follow up on what was just said, because I think this is a great, great question. Who are the poor? It's a great question, because I do think that we often operate with a lot of maybe misconceptions about who the poor actually are. Case in point, I recently listened to a number of speeches given by high school students addressing some of the passages of St. John Chrysostom, and also looking at the issue of wealth inequality. They were presented with a question about wealth inequality. And one of the things that jumped out at me was the frequency with which the students made a correlation between poverty and laziness. They often referred to hard work as being that thing which would prevent one from becoming poor. Now, there is some truth to that, but I think that if we really take a look at who the poor are, it kind of challenges that assumption. Often, the poor are people who are employed, gainfully employed, who are working very hard, but simply do not have a wage that sustains them and their families, a wage that does not allow them to buy basic necessities. Another segment of the poor are children. Actually, a very large segment of the poor are children who are therefore not at working age, but are lacking food and often shelter and clothing and basic things that other students have. We have people who are poor because they are physically disabled, poor because they are past working age and don't have enough income coming in to support themselves. And so we have a diverse population of people who are poor, and not to mention military veterans. So I think that if we get at the heart of who the poor actually are, it can assist us in working with the poor to address the problems that have resulted in the situation of poverty.
So some analysis is in order.
Yeah, I think so.
Richard, do you have some thoughts?
Well, the whole area puzzles me, when you go in like the previous speaker and spread it all out, or like Rhonda, you itemize it. It sort of shorts me out, and then I ask myself, well, who are the poor? And then, well, what strikes me now, I'm 85 now, and boy, I'm feeling the pinch more than I ever did before, so I guess I'm poorer now, and then you say, well, how good is that? Well, you say, well, it sure makes it makes me think of God more, and you're more dependent, so I guess that's a good thing, but that's about the extent of my wisdom on the point. So I'll let other people discuss it, but the question bemuses me,
Well, we have come to expect from you, Richard, some down home, on the ground kind of reflections, and yours just now calls to mind an old Catholic worker story that might be appropriate here. Once upon a time, Sergeant Shriver, very close to the Kennedys, very much engaged in anti-poverty work at an important level, perfectly legitimate level, visited one of the Catholic workers in Iowa. And there were a group of people there, and he said, what is it that the poor need? What do the poor really need? And the fellow in the back of the room got up and he said, teeth. That's the story. The idea is, I think many of the people who are really poor have some immediate, serious need. And I think if we're in touch with them on a one-to-one basis, we oftentimes know what it is and can do something about it. Did I just hear a beep? Hello?
Hello.
Everybody there or nobody there?
No, it sounds as if someone came on to ask questions.
You have to get used to these things.
So no. If someone came on to ask a question, what is your question? Oh, wait, it could have been your friend getting that call that she thought she might get.
Well, I'm not sure. Well, Kemi, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, okay. I told Kemi that we sometimes have some technical glitches.
No, but we also have people calling in to listen. So if you're calling in just to listen, that's fine. But if you have a question or a comment, we're very happy to take it.
Well, let me go ahead from this teeth thing. Now, we know from talking with Richard that lots of times what he needs is a reliable driver. And it sounds like Rhonda needs a reliable driver, right?
Oh no, I have a wonderful, reliable driver.
But for now you do. And at any rate, it's interesting if I could go from the Catholic worker anecdote to something philosophical and theological. Thomas Aquinas says that there's a legitimate place for private property, and he discusses it in various places. but in one central place in which Aquinas discusses poverty and private property. He says the first reason that he gives for a wide distribution of private property is that if property is widely distributed, then we'll know, because we're at a ground level, who among us has some need, and we'll be in a position to meet that need. So why should you own things on your own? Well, if as many people as possible own things on their own, then we'll have a whole lot of people on the ground who can immediately meet the needs of people who don't have enough. And I also think that that's a striking argument and an unexpected argument for the distribution of private property.
Okay, so now a thing that bothers me is this. There are people who were very rich, who were Catholics, and I'm sure Orthodox too, that would fit, who give a lot to the poor, but they also live very luxuriously at the same time. So I know there are fathers of the church that have said that your luxuries belong to the poor. And then in one of the social encyclicals, I think by Paul VI, it says Christians should have a simple and austere lifestyle. So living luxuriously is hardly a simple and austere lifestyle. So even though it's wonderful how much they gave to the poor, there's a question there, and then especially in terms of revolution, if all the rich were doing what Thomas Aquinas said they should be doing, I don't think we would have had the French Revolution or the Communist Revolution.
And they surely didn't. In order to avoid any gaps and to stir the pot a bit more, it is an important consideration that if we're to avoid poverty, people need to have jobs. Mm-hmm. And in order to have jobs, there has to be today technology, industry, communications. All of these things, I suppose you could put together under the term of infrastructure and the term of means of production. And I can't go out and buy a factory, and you can't go out and buy a factory, and all of us together, probably including our listeners, can't put together the money to build a factory and to market everything. So there does have to be capital, and so there has to be a certain accumulation of wealth in order to bring about real jobs for all sorts of people. And I think that factor can't be lost sight of either.
Well, a thing that enormously influenced me when I first started teaching ethics, and I was trying to find a good text for social justice. So I got this book, Food First. I forget the author's names now. But anyway, I used to teach it for years. And I was amazed when I read this very famous classic on social justice. It was written by people who were, I think, sociologists. And what they were showing was that in more primitive culture, you didn't have a huge problem of poverty at all because people put food first, and they even had ways of storing seeds so that if there was a famine, they would still have seeds even for a few years to plant, things like that. And that it was the whole capitalist industrialist system that led to people putting, luxuries above, that the poor countries were busy producing strawberries and asparagus instead of the food that they needed, that they used to plant before. So I don't know, I'm sure, Jim, you're probably familiar with that book.
Well, I'm not sure if I'm familiar with that particular book, and a lot of books that I was familiar with, I'm not so familiar with now. But I would like to say that one of the problems in what's the word we use today, our national conversation about poverty, one problem is that people can romanticize. They can romanticize the nobility of the rich, and they can romanticize the decency of the poor, and they can certainly romanticize life in underdeveloped countries, to use that word. Even Mother Teresa, when she would speak, would oftentimes talk about the terrible poverty in the West, and there is a terrible poverty. But there's also, at a quasi-institutional level, slavery in India. And there is certainly a dissolution of family life in India. And I'm sure in less developed countries there's a propensity to share, but there has to be more than that, because if there's not more than that, one of the things we know historically as a fact about undeveloped countries is babies die young, children die young. There's a terrible infant mortality rate, and there's a need for basic medicine and medical care and good, clean water. I think the number one cause of death in the world today is a lack of clean water. So there are all sorts of things that need to be done that take money, that take technology, but it has to be used wisely, and oftentimes we're not in a position to use it wisely because we're not involved in that sphere. We need Catholic engineers, Christian engineers. We need Catholic businessmen, Christian businessmen. It really is a case of not trying to, as Leo XIII would say, trying to put one class against another, but to bring them all into some sort of coherent pattern of cooperation. And that, good grief, spare us, O Lord, that could lead us to politics and political action.
Yes.
Now, it just
agree.
so happens there's a party developing in this country called the American Solidarity Party. Some have called it the rivulet of the future. And our guest, Kemi Ingram, has just been elected to the National Committee of the American Solidarity Party, and she herself comes from Murrieta, which is what I think a lot of people would refer to as a hard scrabble place. And maybe, Kemi, you'd like to say a little bit about how all of this could lead us in a political direction.
Well, following up on what you just said, I think that working with the poor, and I do say working with, not for, because I think that the poor need to be involved in addressing the problems. But we're often presented with a false dichotomy that tackling these issues should either only be reserved for those on the front line who are in the communities ministering to these different populations of poor people, or working at the high level to address issues like public policy. And instead of that cooperation, sometimes there's a bit of antagonism between the two groups, and I don't think that needs to be so. We need the people who are in the trenches day in and day out, providing the basic services and helping people, for example, who don't have addresses to get jobs, because not having an address can prevent someone from finding employment. But at the same time, we have to address, as you mentioned, many of those structural issues that contribute to poverty itself. You mentioned things like clean water, clean air. Those are environmental justice issues that disproportionately affect people who are poor. so working with the American Solidarity Party, I'm happy to say that our platform does address these issues and incorporates language that will enable us to put forward and support policies that address not just the day-to-day, but also those structural issues, those policy challenges that contribute to situations of poverty. So yes, I'm happy to now be working with the American Solidarity Party, and I look forward to seeing the ways in which the principles of the party support those who are both working in the trenches and the poor themselves.
Thank you.
That brings up a question I was hoping that it would be addressed, because it confuses me a lot, is that even though capitalism has all these evils connected with it, the motive of greed that leads people to try to make a lot of money by creating some sort of business, like because I teach philosophy, I love reductio ad absurdum. That is, you take the most ridiculous example just to push through a point. Okay, someone decided in the 70s it would be nice to start a business called Pet Rocks, R-O-C-K-S, Pet Rocks. And what they were they had nice shiny rocks that they found. They honed them down a little, put a little red ribbon around them, put them in a gift box, and everyone was giving each other pet rocks. They probably made millions of dollars on this business. It's totally unrelated to any basic human needs, right? I mean, there's no way you could consider this as meeting some basic human need, and meanwhile people are starving, blah, blah, blah. So that's like the extremes of capitalism. You sell anything, no matter how worthless or how evil, just to make money. That's the worst side. On the other hand, the good side was that you had much, much less of the most dire poverty that we associated with the time before industrialism, let's say, and capitalism was, everywhere, so huge. And so this question bothers me, that if we move in some sort of socialist direction, some people think the American Solidarity is moving in.
Who would think that? But go ahead.
If we move in that direction by taking away the motive of greed, do we take away jobs? Like recently I'm reading on the news that there are these workers now, because the minimum wage has been augmented, now they're just losing their jobs. So I don't know, there's these anomalies. So I was wondering what you all think.
Richard, you've been listening too long.
Well, I mean, all right. So Rhonda just brought up something I read about in the last day or two. In certain states, they heightened the minimum wage, and they found out it makes things worse. And then it brings in the debate. Some people say, no, that's not true. If you heighten the minimum wage, it's an improvement. So you have this eternal thing. You think it's an empirical thing, you could settle it, but it doesn't stay settled. And I think the reason is, when you go by an ideology, you want your view to be right, and you want the other guys to be wrong. Well, that continues. And there's no empirical way of deciding. I think there is, but then you'd have to put aside your favorite views and go with the facts. Well, a lot of times people don't want to go with the facts because they don't agree with their ideology. So I don't know how that helps the question, but anyway.
Well, it helps it a lot because it shows us how difficult the question is.
Right. I mean, people go bananas, like him. All right. Yeah, I think they ask certain questions and people are guaranteed to go crazy. And in a crazy age, man, we're crazy. So here, let me try to put the question that centralizes things. It seems to me that the prime human defect is to resent the injustice done to us. Now, the point is we're all going to be treated unjustly, so we're all going to have a legitimate reason for resentment. Now, the mysterious thing is the Our Father says we can't give in to resentment. We can't, even though we have all kind of justification for it. We have to forgive our enemies as the Father forgives us. And then I say, well, at least here I'm on a general point, and as mysterious as the advice is, it seems to be right, because if you're going to live on resentment, you're going to destroy yourself. You don't destroy the object of you destroy yourself. So I say, well, okay, that's a lesson I can take care of and I can apply to all kind of situations. So to me then I say that's a good question because it gives you a good answer. And, there you have it. That's my...
Well, but couldn't that lead into a sort of stoic resignation where you say, okay, there's all this injustice in the world. Anything to do is going to bring out the bad. So the communists thought they were going to get rid of all poverty by killing off the rich and so on and so forth. And then they became worse tyrants than any rich people ever had been, and blah, blah, blah. So just to watch TV and forget about it.
See, the answer to that is you have Christ as God. And he puts up with a lot of indignities that naturally would make a God resentful. Hey, if I were God and my creatures try to do any of that stuff to me that they did to Christ, they wouldn't last very long. That's damn sure, okay? I wouldn't put up with that crap.
Language. Go ahead.
Yes, but Christ did, see? And that's the mystery. That somehow we're and I suppose what we do is if we put it up now and suffer like Christ, we'll triumph, but in God's good time, and that's after we die. And I say, well, all right, that's close enough to the Catholic message. And, it calls for a certain passivity. And like Christ, he stood before his persecutors like a sheep, dumb sheep. So, then you say, well, what's wrong with being a dumb sheep? If Christ were a dumb sheep, hey, you're following Christ, and you can be a dumb sheep without getting all bent out of shape about it.
Richard, maybe you'd accept a friendly amendment.
Go ahead.
You used the word passivity.
Right.
How about we switch from passivity to receptivity? Receptivity.
Ah.
It's hard to be actively passive. In fact, I think there's a syndrome that has a name like that. But it's quite different when we talk about an active receptivity. And one of the aspects of active receptivity would be actively listening to people and to their experiences. Now, I'm just batting things around here. I specialize in random thoughts. But Kemi, coming into the show, wouldn't know that Rhonda's mother went to the Soviet Union shortly after it became the Soviet Union and took with her to the Soviet Union a kind of real openness to what was happening there. And she wasn't at all impressed, as I recall her telling it. About
No, you got it all mixed up there.
Oh, dear. That's the second time I got something mixed up, all mixed up. I remember back in 1987 that happened to me. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. My grandmother, who was my parents came from Russia. My mother came from Russia, and she was 1 year old in the year 1899.
Whoa.
Okay. Her mother went back to the Soviet Union because they were all like leftists, and they thought that Russia was a terrific, beautiful dream. And she did like being back in Russia, but she didn't think communism was necessarily the cat meow either.
Okay. Well, I introduced my garbled version of this just to point out how much we have to be actively listening to what's gone on, not just in the last week, not just in the last 5 years, but in the last 50 years, in the last 100 years. And a whole lot of us are historically illiterate, and we need to do that. And then a whole lot of us, I think, I'm just putting words together, tech illiterate and industry illiterate and business illiterate, and we got to do a lot of hard listening in terms of particular social programs that might just work. And it involves all kinds of good social science. And I think Kemi wants the American Solidarity Party to draw on the best social science and the best political science available. And we can't do all of these things at the same time. I'm sure that there are plenty of people in the American Solidarity Party that are, with respect to the history of philosophy, fairly illiterate. And we can supply something there, and a lot of the tech people can supply things, and a lot of the poli-sci people can supply things. And Richard's reminding us that we center on Christ can keep us all together, I hope. And Kemi, you might be interested that Rhonda is herself a member of the American Solidarity Party, and if memory serves, Richard, who looked at the original platform, thought it was pretty doggone good, he said gruffly. And now you could say something maybe about the new platform.
Well, I'd like to pick up on that notion of receptivity. Okay,
back to the beginning
instead of passivity. And I would buy the receptivity, and because it brought this example. As you get older, things happen to you. You reach for something and you spill it, and all kind of things you used to do, you're not able to do. You goof it up and all that business. And the immediate reaction, I guess, is to resent it and to curse. At least that's mine. And then, well, if I were properly receptive, the truth is, what's happening to you in the present, God knows, and there's a purpose for it, and the purpose is to make you better, okay? So instead of cursing, like it shouldn't be, well, you try to accept it, because somehow it's to improve you. Although, you got to take that as a general, too, because in immediate detail, you don't see how it improves you. It ruins your disposition. But I mean, it's this kind of receptivity that what happens to you, God allows, and it's for your good. Wow, that's quite a thought when you're getting your leg amputated, or when you get run over and end up in a hospital. And then you say, well, this is for my good. God intends it. Okay, well, that's a big thought now, isn't it?
Okay, but that argument has been used for centuries by people who say the poor you will have always with you, the poor are holier than us, so we don't have to do anything to bring about social justice.
I suppose people who say that, yeah.
So, I mean, people say, well, since you can't prove that the program of the American Solidarity Party is going to work because It has the usual flaws of optimistic social justice programs, that it concentrates on how people could relate well if they were all good, well-intentioned, and yet since that's not contrary to at least 50% of human nature isn't well-intentioned. I mean, 50% in each of us, maybe, and so forth and so on. So if you take out the greed motive, people would rather just, in resignation, just sit and take cheap drugs than, try to figure out how to change the United States of America.
All right, Kemi, you can't escape.
I'm back. Sorry, it looks like the call dropped.
Oh, okay. You missed various points here, but that's all right because we tend to repeat ourselves, so you'll catch them again. Did you hear me say that Rhonda is a member of the ASP?
No, I didn't.
Well, so you've missed at least 5 minutes of good stuff.
My goodness.
And that Richard read the original platform and said in his own gruff way, pretty good, or words to that effect. And we have a new platform, and you might like to say something about that. But in saying something about that, Rhonda has called our attention to, the enduring effects of original sin in all of us, and how a great many people, even if they don't think about things in terms of original sin, think about things in terms of how hard it is to bring whole huge groups of people forward, and how easy it is to be a free rider in 100 different ways.
Oh, well, okay, let's give one example. I think when I first saw these big buildings going up in New York City where I live, in slum areas, they put in a big building to get people off the streets, out of the attics and the cellars, into this housing for the poor, access housing, we call it now, right? Okay, and it seemed like this was terrific. Here they are in this beautiful new building. Well, by 20 years later, people knew that these places were gang-ridden, that they were, that people were on drugs, that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it makes me just have this wariness that looking at something that looks very good for eliminating one problem, then, unless this is, you see what I mean? It makes me discouraged a little.
Well, one of the things that I mentioned, Kemi, that you might not have heard, or at any rate I want to mention it again, is we all have so many strengths, and we all have so many areas in which we know very little at all. Now, when I think of Rhonda's example, which is a telling example, and it happened in city after city, I think, yes, but there's a big difference between Robert Moses and Jane Addams. We have people like Robert Moses who had a certain view of what New York City should be like. And it was very much a top-down view, and it was very much a view that didn't connect with what was going on at the ground level. And then we had somebody like Jane Addams who wrote about neighborhoods and how to preserve neighborhoods. And at no point would somebody like Jane Addams have thought that high-rise structures are the way to go. And yet, of course, we're still doing the same thing. I think Kemi's originally from England. We have this terrible disaster in England, and it's based on poorly made high-rise structures and it leads to the conflagration and the death by burning of dozens and dozens of poor people. So you have to think hard in philosophy, work through the arguments, and in technology do the same, and in urban studies do the same, but there has to be some sort of animating, cohesive spirit. And I think the core teachings of Orthodoxy, Catholicism, in the American Solidarity Movement were close to Kuyperian reform thinking. All of this hard thinking has to be done together. At any rate, I ran my mouth again. Kemi, please.
Absolutely. And, I mean, you mentioned the Grenfell Tower disaster. I'm originally from the San Francisco Bay Area, but I've lived in England twice. I've done 2 stints abroad. And most recently, we spent a little bit of time near that tall tower, that example of poor architecture and everything that has gone along with it. And it's interesting, though, contributes to many of the issues faced by those residents because of the housing prices in London, you do have situations in which landlords, whether they be councils or individuals, feel that they can get away with anything, even using poor materials on structures that house many, many people. But one of the other interesting things about London, for those who've never been there, is the fact that you have housing structures like those for the poor situated right next to million-pound mansions. So just the way in which the community is defined there is a little different. Here in the States, we have a tendency to place housing in certain areas, not necessarily all mixed the way it is there. But going back, I think if we root any of the things that we do in human dignity, I think we're off to a good start because looking at things like dignity of labor, and the idea that no type of work is more important than another, you then have to look at compensation for the different types of work being done. I think it's really complex, and I think you just have to be honest about the level of complexity involved in addressing issues of housing and food and employment and all of those other things that are factors in addressing issues of poverty.
Yes. Let me shift the ground, excuse me, a little bit here. There's a contemporary philosopher named Peter Singer, S-I-N-G-E-R, who gets a lot of attention. And in many areas, I think he has little to offer. But when it comes to the distribution of goods and resources and wealth and the like, I think he has more to offer. I don't think he's right, but I mention him because people who are reading things will run across the name Peter Singer. And his basic approach, and this takes us back to something that Rhonda said earlier, his basic approach is really consequentialist or utilitarian. And he wants to argue that if this company or this individual has more money than it needs, it has an obligation to distribute it to people who have less money than they need. And for example, he'll say, very specifically, he'll say, if you were thinking of going to dinner tonight and taking a friend and going to the movie afterwards, you might be thinking in terms of $75. Now, with $75, if you were to give it to Catholic Relief Services or Oxfam, you could do such and such. And clearly that would be a better use of your money. So guess what? You have an obligation to go to the evening out? Absolutely not. You have an obligation to direct your money to meet the needs of those who are in grave poverty. Now, if everyone were to do that, which is kind of a Kantian question, suppose we made everyone do that, there certainly would be a redistribution in wealth. And much of contemporary conversation in the political level is about the need for redistribution. And many of the complaints against the Republicans is they want to continue redistribution to the rich and away from any decent distribution to the poor. Now, on the other hand, to put this into a different kind of a framework, we oftentimes say charity begins at home, and I need to do something for my family, and the kids would really benefit from a week at the beach. And why can't I take my own kids to the beach for a week? Or we say, man does not live by bread alone. It's really hard to have decent music in this city, and it's really tough to keep the symphony going, and why can't I give my money to the symphony? Or why can't I give this extra money to the art museum? Or why can't I give my extra money to X, Y, or Z? Now, one thing that I would like to bring forward is there are a number of basic human goods. And in thinking of how we could use our wealth, we surely should think about those who are in grave physical need, but we can also think about the role of beauty and how beauty needs, believe it or not, financial support, and the role of knowledge, and knowledge needs financial support. So one thing that I think is useful when we come to think about the poor and how we could use our resources is that the poor share in the same basic goods as we all do, or they should. So giving money to support parks, I think, is a very good thing. Now, back to the charity at home. I wanted to get in another pitch for what Catholics refer to, the individual that Catholics refer to as the common doctor, Thomas Aquinas. And in his discussion of doing good for others, he makes this distinction between those who are in grave need and those who are closest to us, our family. And it's easy if the people who are in the greatest need are members of our own family. Well, of course, that's where you should give your attention. And Mother Teresa oftentimes spoke about the poorest of the poor and how we ought to look for them first within our own family. At the same time, Thomas says that we have really difficult decisions to make. So at one point he says, and this will be a short quote, and it's using an old translation, but the old translation is more literal. Thomas says, "For it must be understood that other things being equal, one ought to help those rather who are most closely connected with us. And if of two, one be more closely connected and the other in greater want, it's not possible to decide by any general rule which of them we ought to help rather than the other, since there are various degrees of want as well as of connection. And the matter requires the judgment of a prudent man." And what he's saying is we've indicated among ourselves that we think there are tough questions. He would say there are tough questions here as well. Do you help somebody who's far away, or do you help somebody who's close at hand? Well, ordinarily you help somebody who's close at hand. But if you know that you can't effectively help somebody who's far away, and that person who's far away is in grave need, he says, in some cases, he says, we have an obligation to help a stranger rather even than our own father. But all of this requires a certain prudence. Now, by prudence, Thomas doesn't mean, let me think it over. Well, I need another 6 months to think it over. What he means by prudence is a person who exercises good judgment and shows himself or herself to exercise judgment, good judgment, repeatedly. And so that's the person we ought to appeal to. Now, at the social level, how's this for high hopes? It could be that a new party will show itself to be given to practical reason about these difficult cases. And Richard mentioned earlier on about how we tend to follow our own ideology to keep the war of facts going. If we could be reasoned and impartial and able to look at things as they really are, I think the party, even if it doesn't win in the next election or if it never wins at all, could be a beacon, could be at the social and political level serving the role of the prudent party, that is to say, the party that exercises good practical reasoning.
Sounds wonderful.
And maybe we're down to the last 6 minutes. Maybe we could also think about, Richard was speaking of the centrality, and of course this is the case, the centrality of Jesus. When the apostles of John, the disciples of John, come to Jesus and ask Jesus, are you the anointed one? Jesus says many things, but one of the key things that he says is, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. And the poor have the gospel preached to them. Well, certainly we're among the poor who need the gospel preached to us. And if we're to follow in Jesus' way, we need to preach the gospel, and we need to preach the gospel by living it. But if we're teachers and we're communicators, part of the way that we live the gospel is by our teaching of social justice and respect for life and the whole of the political and social direction that the church would have us follow. So that was another little free sermon.
Right.
Well, Kemi?
Well, I'd like to pick up on what you were saying about prudence, what St. Thomas says. Now, the fascinating thing about prudence is not science. See, science can deal with certain questions with precision and certitude and come to a conclusion, but they're broad questions, science. Prudence means you're in the actual situation of life, and it isn't preordained what you should do. You know you should do the right thing, but what's the right thing in a lot of our circumstances? Well, our circumstances vary infinitely, and the times vary infinitely, and everything varies, see? So you can set up something general like do the right thing or follow Christ. Now, you can't be wrong about that. But what that looks like in the particular, you don't know. And you'll only know when you hit the occasion, and then you come up with a decision. But it's you're flying by the seat of your pants with prudence. And I think, I suppose, if you teach what endures and is steady and it's more speculative, but when it comes to action, you get a little wary and you don't try to put actions down in too severe an order because it varies too much, see. So you don't. So you leave people room for prudence. If you try to tighten it too much, you might get them fighting with each other. Yeah. And you don't want to do that.
And Thomas says one of the marks of the prudent person is that he or she takes counsel with others. So I think that's a crucial aspect of it. And maybe we could say we're taking counsel with each other on this show, The Open Door, which we have 2 minutes left to consider. And Rhonda often closes with a prayer, and my favorite prayer is so short that I can include that with Rhonda's, it being, "Come, Holy Spirit." And perhaps, Kemi, if you have an Orthodox prayer.
Lord have mercy on us all and help us to avoid extremes, help us to avoid either cynicism or sentimental optimism in favor of prudent truth and good judgment.
Amen. Amen. Next week our topic is going to be pragmatism. And just to put a preliminary spin on it, there's a philosopher, Sidney Morgenbesser, who said, pragmatism looks good in theory, but doesn't really work in practice.
Right.
So we can work with that sentiment and see where it takes us next week. And I want to thank each and every one of you, and especially our visitor, and I'm hoping that the listeners gain something from our discussion. And maybe if we have 10 seconds left, St. Junipero Serra always used to say, this was his motto, always forward.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.